So my name is Hala Alyan, and I'm a Palestinian-American poet, writer, clinical psychologist. I live in Manhattan, and I spent my childhood growing up between the Middle East and the United States, so we moved around a lot. And I think that has really impacted my idea of what diaspora means. I think it's impacted my writing a lot. It's impacted my relationship to cities. And so I think those are definitely themes that come up a lot in my writing. Diaspora figures in my poetry in the sense that it's kind of like the imaginary character that's always there, even if I'm not talking directly about it or referencing it. I think when I reread the things that I've written, what kind of grabs me or jumps out to me is that there's a lot of like love affairs with space and places and land and cities, and I think there's a kind of restlessness that I've had since I was a child that I think goes hand in hand with being a member of a diaspora, that I do think does translate into how I write, in that I do experiment a lot with different styles and will sometimes be really sort of enthralled with a certain way of writing or a certain theme or a certain topic or whatever, and then kind of lose interest in it and have to move on to another one. So there is kind of this, like, if not physical restlessness, which I do think I have as well, there's definitely one of the imagination. Like my day job as a psychologist, it complements my world as a writer and as a poet really, really beautifully. I think if you really think about what clinical psychology is, what it means to be a therapist, it really is to listen to stories all day long, and to help people kind of shape their voices and carve out sort of their own narratives and sort of reclaim their narratives. So I think I'm constantly thinking in terms of narrative and in terms of like coherence and whatnot. So in that sense, I think being a clinical psychologist makes me a stronger writer and a stronger poet, and I think vice versa. I think by being someone who has been in like a voracious reader since I learned how to read, I do think that it makes you kind of look at the world in a certain way and listen for certain things that I do think help me as a therapist. One of the classes that I teach at NYU is cross-cultural therapy, cross-cultural counseling, and the idea there is how to become kind of a culturally competent clinician and practitioner. To be culturally competent, the idea is that you have appropriate skills, you have appropriate awareness, and you are cognizant of yourself as a cultural being as well when you're in the room with a client from somewhere else, So you're able not only to tolerate difference, but to kind of embrace it and work with it and meet people where they're at. So an example of that would be if you are meeting someone from a particular country in Africa or in East Asia or something like that, and you have a certain idea of what that country is or what that person's background should be, to be aware of what your biases are coming in, and then to give the client the opportunity and the space to speak for themselves and to kind of describe their individual experience coming from that background and what it means for them to have come from that background. So the idea is that there is no such thing as like, this is how you do therapy with Arabs, or this is how you do therapy with Asian Americans, but that every single person that comes in is going to be their own kind of universe of experiences. I've become really interested, and I've been doing this more and more, in like kind of creating fictional characters and writing poetry through them. The book that's going to come out later this year, Hijra, has like a whole section where the titles are just women's names, and then kind of their narrative or their story through poetry. And these are on one hand they're fictionalized stories, but they're also the stories of like my grandmothers and then my aunts and my father's aunts, my mother's aunts. And so I think that's sort of an example of, both looking at someone else's experience as something that is obviously culturally different than my own, but not trying to steer away from generalizing and trying to kind of move more in the direction of giving, even if they are fictionalized characters or fictionalized accounts, trying to make them seem as individual as possible. So I'm more interested, like rather than writing about war as this abstract, enormous, all-encompassing thing. I would rather write about like one individual picking up like a piece of shrapnel, you know, in the aftermath of war, you know, or one person hearing the sound of like a drone coming towards it. Like, I feel like those are, for me, the more, I mean, that just makes it more human, and I think makes it more, at least for me, more like relatable to read about. I think obviously the bombing of the street was a tragedy and a travesty, and in a lot of ways, I mean, if we're talking about specificity, in a lot of ways, that one act kind of encapsulates a lot of what has happened in Iraq in, you know, the last decade and more. So for me, this idea of being able to prioritize and allow for a stage and a platform for writers and artists and thinkers to be able to think freely, to be able to embrace their difference freely, and be able to kind of circulate those ideas amongst each other is so incredibly empowering. And I love the idea of like the street starts here, like this idea of, again, that there is an ocean and a continent and many things between here and Iraq, but in a lot of ways there is so much overlap, and there's so much humanity in being able to say, like, I stand with that, and I believe in this project, and I think that's what everyone who's part of it really does, in a way that very much feels like visceral, like it's more than just lip service. The people that are doing this truly believe in their mission, truly believe in their project.